Well, hello, and welcome to the first Wednesday night Bible study of 2021. What an amazing thing to make another trip around the sun, to have our world get another year older and to pass through another year. I know it's been quite difficult for a lot of people, and we are praying for you. And if we can help you somehow here at the church, we want to. We can't unless we know what your needs are, and so we need you to communicate that with us. We're here for you. We want to help. We love you, and we hope you know that. I really hope that you do. So, as we begin this new year, we are out of the prison epistles. I know some of you are thinking, "My goodness, we've been looking at the prison epistles for quite some time now," and we have. But that's because there's a lot there to go through. I was talking to someone Sunday, and they said, "I would have never thought that it would have taken us a month to go through the one chapter letter to Philemon." Well, certainly it did, because the Lord has a lot to communicate to us if we will just pause and reflect and look on that. And so, as we move into a new year, for the next 13 weeks, we are going to be studying characters of the Bible. We call this a character study for obvious reasons. We're going to be studying the characters of the Bible as they are warriors in various different types of ways. Now, I told you about this last week, that we're going to call this study the Warriors of the Bible, and I'm looking forward to that. Some of these people that we study will be legitimate soldiers and warriors, others not so much, but I consider them to be warriors based on some things that they do. And so the first one that we're going to study in this 13-week course is Abraham. Now, you might not think of Abraham as a warrior, and I certainly didn't either until I was teaching the book of Genesis a few months ago to our college class. I say a few months ago. I guess it's been over a year now as we were studying Genesis together. And we came to Genesis 13 and 14. And it's such an amazing passage of how Abraham literally goes to war. He battles to save his family. And that's what we're going to talk about today for a short and brief period of time. So Abraham, when we think about him, we have this idea in our mind. But before we get to our idea of Abraham, let's first look at what the Bible tells us about Abraham. So we're going to ask the question then, who was Abraham? Well, first of all, Abraham was a nobody. What do I mean by that? Abraham was just a guy. He lived in Ur of the Chaldees. There is some extra biblical sources that say his father was an idol maker for that area. I don't know if we can trust those sources or not. Perhaps he was. I don't know. But Abraham was just a guy. Abraham was married to Sarah, and he was the husband of a childless woman. Now, Abraham only has, I think in Scripture we read that he has around 8 children, and you get that towards the end of his life where the other children are mentioned there. But 2 notable ones are Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael is Abraham's son that he had with Hagar. Hagar was the Egyptian slave girl of Sarah. It's believed by most scholars that Hagar was one of those women, one of those slaves who was gifted to Abraham after Sarah and Abraham passed through Egypt, and Pharaoh tries to take Sarah as his wife, and ultimately Abraham interjects, and God interjects there as well. And so Abraham knows that God is going to give him a child. He knows that he's going to have this promised child. But one thing about Abraham, and one thing that we have like Abraham, is we try to take God's promises and kind of scoot them along. We try to push them along in some way. And so Abraham, being married to this elderly woman who has not had a child, well, how are they going to have a child now? So he says, well, I can have a child, just not with Sarah. And so he has a child with Hagar, Ishmael, who would become the father of the Arab race as well. But then he has a child with Sarah, the child of promise. This is Isaac. And Isaac is ultimately going to be more favored than Ishmael by Sarah, of course, because it's Sarah's actual son. and Ishmael and Hagar leave the camp, and Isaac then grows up and takes over as the head of the clan here that Abraham has. Now, one thing that actually, let me do that on the next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself. The third thing we know about Abraham is that he was an obedient man. We often go to Genesis 22 to look at the obedience of Abraham and the faith of Abraham because God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And Abraham, so far as we know in the text, is very willing to do that because of his obedience and because of his faith. But I would argue that when you go back to when Abraham is called out of the land, God says, I will bring you to a land that I will show you. God never tells Abraham where he's going. He tells him the general region, but never where he's going. And to leave everything, to leave your home, to leave everything, and to go follow God is ultimately the call of every Christian. But for Abraham, it shows his obedience. And I would argue that you cannot have obedience without also having faith. The fourth thing we know about Abraham is that he's the father of the nation of Israel. Now, we might call him the grandfather, perhaps even the great-grandfather, because it is the 12 sons of Jacob that ultimately form the great nation of Israel as a lineage where your blood could be traced back. Now, Abraham, when he leaves Ur of the Chaldees from his father, he has slaves, he has possessions. He is this sheikh over this great, vast community. But none of those people are blood related to him, or if they are, like Lot and Eleazar, they will be distantly related. So it's not until we get to the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob, that you get that bloodline brought back. But the covenant begins with Abraham in Genesis 12. God cuts the covenant with him. They take the animals and they split them in half, and God walks through those animals. In that ancient time, that was a very symbolic way of saying, may what has happened to these animals happen to me if I do not fulfill my end of the bargain. And of course, God cannot lie. God can't deny himself. God is going to fulfill the promise that he does. It took God a while to do that in our time frame, certainly not in his. But we know Abraham as the father of the nation of Israel. And we also know that Abraham was a man who greatly feared conflict. And this is going to play a big role in looking at Abraham as a warrior. When Abraham goes to Egypt, he tells Sarah, tell them you're my sister. That's a half-truth. Sarah was Abraham's half-sister. But Abraham says, tell them you're my sister, not my wife, because they might try to take you. And ultimately they do. The same thing happens when they pass through with Melchizedek. So you have Abraham who fears conflict so much that he goes out of his way to construct these various things in order to avoid that conflict. In fact, what leads to the battle that we're going to study today with Abraham is he and Lot have a conflict. Well, he and Lot don't have a conflict. Their herdsmen have a conflict because their possessions had grown so great. And the conflict then comes as a result of their clash. And Abraham, rather than dealing with the conflict, tells Lot, look, you pick wherever you want to go, and I'll go in the opposite direction. So Abraham is a man who greatly avoids conflict. And that is a lesson to us that when you avoid conflict, conflict only heightens. All right? Now, that's what the Bible tells us about Abraham. But we get this picture. Every one of us has a stereotypical view of characters in the Bible. And one thing that I want to do as we study this is I want us to get the stereotypical view out of our mind, at least in parts where it's inappropriate. So we have this view of Abraham as a pushover. You know, Sarah comes to Abraham and she says, I can't stand Hagar, I can't stand Ishmael, put them out of the camp. And Abraham does, you know, he's a pushover in that way. He lets Lot take whatever he wants and go to the best parts wherever he wants. He doesn't necessarily care about being a leader, and that's the stereotypical guy that we get. really what it boils down to is that Abraham believes that in the moment what he's doing is the right thing. And I think we all have been there at some point or another where we've been challenged with some things and we've been faced with some conflict, and we think that what we're doing is the right thing, but then you look back on it and we say, well, maybe not. Maybe that wasn't the right thing to do. We know Abraham is a man of great faith, and that is a stereotype that needs to stay there. Abraham is certainly a man of great faith, mentioned twice in Hebrews chapter 11, what we call the hall of faith. He's mentioned at the very beginning and then later on about halfway through the chapter. Abraham is a man of great faith. I do think it took a minute for Abraham's faith to grow in that capacity, but Abraham is a man of great faith because the lessons that he learned by living and experiencing these times of conflict showed him the only way to get through it is to be a man of faith. Number 4, we think of Abraham as an old, feeble man. That's the stereotype. I want to remove that from our minds. People in the ancient world, especially around the time of Abraham, lived a great length of time. They had a very long life, and I think their health was much better than ours is today. They certainly didn't have the processed foods, and they had a higher vegetarian diet. You could see there that their health would undoubtedly be better. And what we find in Genesis 13 and 14 is that when Abraham goes into this battle, if you will, to rescue his nephew Lot, he is very physically able to do this. And so we don't need to see him as this old, feeble man, but rather as a man who is advanced in age, but perhaps has his health very well established in him. And number 4, we get the stereotype of Abraham as a nomad. Understand that Abraham as a wanderer is different than Abraham as a nomad. A nomad is someone who aimlessly wanders, or who follows a flock, or who follows animals in pursuit of hunting. That's not what Abraham does. Abraham is being led the entire time by God. That's different from being a nomad. A wanderer perhaps, but a wanderer who's being led by the Almighty. So what does all this have to do with Abraham as a warrior? Well, let's read the text of Genesis 13, verses 2 through 13 together. Now Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he journeyed from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord, and Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And so already we're getting the conflict. Their possessions had grown so great they couldn't dwell together, and it's causing problems not among them, not among Abram and Lot, but among their herdsmen. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take to the left hand, then I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities and valleys, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Now there's a lot to unpack here in this passage, and I just want to take a few moments to do so. The first is that there's clearly a conflict. The conflict is the possessions have gotten so great. I think that's a lesson for us in materialism. Now notice these possessions are blessings from the Lord. They are certainly things that God had provided for them. I'm not at all saying that having possessions is sinful, but possessions can often cause conflict. Perhaps you have experienced this as well. I, being in the auction business, have seen families literally break and divide over possessions and how the possessions are going to be divided. And that's a really a heartbreaking thing to witness. So the possessions and the amount have caused strife and conflict, and so, in an attempt to avoid conflict, Abram says, "Let there be no strife between me and you. Let there be no strife between my herdsmen and your herdsmen." So this is what we're going to do. Wherever you want to go, you can go, and then I will go in the opposite direction. And we'll end it on good accord. That seems like a really good idea. But notice that what Lot chooses is not the best answer. Lot looks out and he sees what's to the east, and he sees, as the Bible puts it, a land that is like the garden, well watered. It's like Egypt. And if you know anything about Egypt in the ancient world, and perhaps even parts of Egypt today, it was incredibly lush and green and great for agriculture. We call it the Fertile Crescent for a reason. The soil there is so good, and the flooding of the Nile and other rivers make it so good for agriculture. And so Lot sees this, and it looks very attractive to him, and he moves in that direction. But what comes up from these great agricultural places? Cities. And there are cities in this area that are called Sodom and Gomorrah, and we know from the text there's a parenthetical statement that says this is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, obviously, but that the men of Sodom were wicked. They were great sinners against the Lord. Now, my ESV that I have here for us to read says that he moved his tent as far as Sodom. The Hebrew text in some English translations says that he pitched his tent toward Sodom. Well, this is where we leave Lot, and the next time we find Lot, he's actually in Sodom. So, it may seem odd for us to start here in chapter 13 because there's no battle. There's what can we learn about Abraham the warrior from this text? Well, the fact is that Abraham doesn't like conflict, but the leaving of Lot is what's going to instigate the conflict that calls for the battle later in chapter 14. So let's read chapter 14, verses 11 through 16. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. The one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies, of Abram. While Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, bore in his house 318 of them, and they went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. So, you need to read from chapter 13 to chapter 14 to get the full context. Let me give you the Cliff Notes version. There are 5 kings who unite together and who try to go on this big conquest. Ultimately, they come and take over Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot is not dwelling toward Sodom at this time. He is actually in Sodom. And Lot is captured along with the others. Well, someone escaped and came and found Abram and told him about this. Now, remember, Abram, even though he doesn't have children at this time, he is the leader of a great clan. He's the sheikh of the clan. He has 318 fighting age men, which I would put around the age of 20 to 22 as a minimum age there, and then exceeding up to whoever's healthy. So that's a lot of people. You take each of these 318 fighting men, maybe they have multiple wives, maybe they have multiple children. You're looking well into the thousands of how many people Abram had in his clan. And so when Abram finds out that his nephew has been taken, he springs into action. The battle ensues. There's a cause, here's the effect. And Abram is successful in this. He fights them by night, under the cover of night. He's successful in this, and he brings back not only Lot, but all the women and people that Lot had with him, and all of their possessions. What a wonderful victory for Abram to have in that particular battle. And so, to wrap up our class today, let's look at the battle. What is it that happens? Well, number one, in trying to avoid and resolve conflict by telling Lot to go on and take wherever he wants, Abraham ultimately becomes involved in a greater conflict. Number two, Abraham was impacted by Lot's decision. We need to realize that decisions that other people make directly impact us, and we need to act accordingly. Number three, Lot ultimately did not learn from his original decision. Lot takes that great land, he finds himself in Sodom, and then as Abraham rescues him, what happens? He doesn't stay with Abraham, he goes back to Sodom. And we read about that in coming chapters. I think it's chapter 18 and 19, where Sodom is leading up to being destroyed and ultimately destroyed in the book of Genesis. And Lot is there. Lot ultimately is rescued. Unfortunately, his wife, as you know, turns to the pillar of salt because she looks back. So, what are some lessons that we can learn from this warrior? What are some lessons that we can learn from Abraham and his battle that ensued? I think there are four things that we can take from this as we try to live our lives as warriors armed in the full armor of God as we are engaged in spiritual warfare every day. The first is that ignoring conflict does not mean that conflict will go away. For Abraham, every time he tries to ignore conflict, the conflict builds, it escalates. And so when we have conflict in our lives, the best thing to do is for us to address it, but to do it humbly, sincerely, and lovingly with the person with whom we have conflict. Number two, we should fight for our loved ones. When we see our loved ones in trouble, we should try to help them. We should pray for them. We should love them where they are, and we should do all we can to help them as we can. Number three, when we see someone headed for evil, we should intervene. And so Abraham sees that Lot is going east. He sees he's going towards Sodom. Abraham perhaps should have said, look, you need to have this area, and I'll go over here and have this area, and taken more initiative rather than putting the ball in Lot's court. Of course, shoulda, coulda, woulda. This has happened thousands of years ago. But for us today, when we see someone engaged in harmful, sinful acts, we need to interject ourselves. We need to tell that person that we love them, that we care about them, that what they're doing is harmful to their spiritual well-being. Friends, this goes beyond seeing someone with a glass of wine or someone who is looking at pornography. Those things are certainly wrong and can lead to horrible things, and we need to interject and help how we can in those situations. But I'm thinking of someone who has a problem missing worship services, someone who spends their time at work all day rather than with their family. Those are things that often go ignored, but we certainly need to lovingly, I can't stress that enough, we need to lovingly say to that person in some way or another, look, I appreciate that you're spending all your time at work, but I think your family would appreciate your time too. That may not be the best way to go about doing that, of course, but we need to look. And what this means for us is we need to take special note of our brothers and sisters. We should not just be around our brothers and sisters on Sunday mornings or whenever the doors are open here at the church. You know, I've heard a lot of people give a lot of criticism. They say, well, I just don't see everybody when I come to church anymore. I understand. I don't see everybody. I'm blessed at being at both services every other week as we alternate there, and I do get to see more people. But being brothers and sisters in Christ means making that phone call, making that visit where it's available, where it's allowed, going out to eat together, having people over in your home. That's what being a brother and sister in Christ is all about. And the challenge there is for us to open our doors and our hearts to those people so that we can build one another up and edify one another in that holy faith. And number four, we should not let our physical limitations keep us from rescuing others from sin. Now, when you look at Abram or Abraham, he obviously has physical limitations. He is elderly. I do think he's healthier than we give him credit for, but he's elderly. Not only that, but he has 318 men. Well, you're going up against 5 kings who obviously would have thousands of fighting men. So Abraham doesn't let that stop him. He sees the need and he goes forth and is successful in that because I think God is on his side. For us, we might say, well, I am limited in this way, and that means I can't do certain things. No, that's not what that means. We all have limitations, but we also have a God who is unlimited. And so, I hear people say, well, the least we can do, or the only thing we can do is pray for them. Well, that may be the one thing that we can do, but it's not the least that we can do. Asking God for help is certainly a great thing that all of us can do for our fellow man. So I hope you've enjoyed this study of Abram or Abraham as a warrior of the Bible. I look forward to studying a different character each week for the next 13 weeks. I hope you're enjoying this as well. Be sure to share this video so others can see it, and we invite others to study the Bible with us. As always, if you have questions or comments, you can get those to me in various ways. And as always, I look forward to our time studying, same time, same place, next week, Lord willing. God bless you. I hope you have a great rest of your week.